Okay, so this is the second time that I'm trying to make this. The first time I tried to make it, I made a mistake in terms of memory, so I'm trying this with somebody else. This is my friend Josh.
Hello.
So I wanted to I'm going to attempt to teach him an English theory, and he's going to do his best to understand it and question me with whatever questions he can think of. Just to verify, Josh, your degree is in what?
Graphic design.
Graphic design, and you have taken no English upper level classes, like 300 plus.
No,
Okay,
no.
so I just need to verify that you're literally learning this from me. You have no idea what this is, other than the fact that I'm telling it to you.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so the one I'm going to do is reader response theory. And reader response theory isn't too bad. But before I can start there, I have to start with a different theory just to kind of link them together because they're so similar.
Okay.
So we're going to start with a thing called new criticism. And new criticism is the idea around the 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s. English used to be part of the history department. So if you learned English, you learned it through history. You did not there was no such thing as a literature department or English degree. If you wanted to learn it, you had to get it through history. This particular guy, whose name I'm not going to go into too much because while he's important, he's not important to the theory you're going to be learning, but his ideas are. His point was English should be its own idea, should be its own department. And other people said, okay, prove it. Show me. Tell me why it should be. So he drew up kind of an academic idea of what writing and literature can be if you look at it purely academically. He had several processes to it, but what it ends up boiling down to is a theory that kind of pioneered everything called new criticism. The way new criticism works is that when you read something, you are reading it for structure, for allegory, for similes, metaphors, things like that. But more importantly, things that do not count are the author or their intent. So if you're the author, it doesn't matter. What you were trying to write about does not count. You ignore that while you're trying to write from new criticism. As well, your interpretation of the work, you leave that out when you're writing. You do not count it. You do not use it. So what you think things mean, what you think the symbolism is supposed to represent, interpretation of a work, you leave all of that out. So if a good example is like Robert Frost. People have read a lot of Robert Frost poems. I don't know if you have.
A few.
Or Shel Silverstein, that's another good one.
Yeah, definitely a lot of Shel Silverstein.
Okay, so if you've read those, you've read some of the poems like where, it kind of ends on kind of a cliffhanger-y note, but there's obvious structure there. It's long enough to have a structure. It's not all freeform. And because of that structure, when you're doing new criticism, those are the things that you're looking at. You're looking at, okay, well, he's using a metaphor here. He's using a simile here. You're looking at the raw mechanics of English. It's like building a house. You're just looking at the boards.
Okay.
If you've ever read the poem The Lady and the Tiger, the poem works where there's a guy and he's standing in front of two doors, and one has a tiger behind it, and one has a pretty lady. That poem ends with him opening a door, but it doesn't say what's behind the door. In new criticism, you stop right where the text has it. And the mantra for new criticism is the text and only the text. So right when the poem stops, that's as far as you interpret. You don't go farther than that.
Okay.
So all of this kind of helped pioneer and make English a department. Now, we're going to fast forward several decades, but remember kind of the ideas that New Criticism has. A new person comes along called Stanley Fish, and this is in like the 60s. Kept looking at New Criticism, which was how English theory was done. It was the only way to do it. And he goes, well, I see what is supposed to be done, but I propose a new idea. What if we can add interpretation into it? He goes, I feel like that space where I feel like the reader should matter more, because unfortunately with New Criticism, the reader does not matter, for good or for ill. So he proposed his own literary critique, his own theory, which was reader response theory. Basically, you're taking the same ideas that New Criticism has. It's New Criticism plus. You're taking the same ideas of New Criticism, where you're looking at structure. You're looking at only the text, only what the text gives you. But you now are allowed to have an interpretation. So when you read something, you can now go, okay, here's what I think this means. And that's okay now.
Huh, okay.
So, if you sit there and you read, a good example would be like kids' books. So, with a kid's book like Green Eggs and Ham, if I'm reading it through New Criticism, I'm only looking at what the text gives me, which it's not very long. There's a rhyming structure, and we can assume that there is some kind of hyperbole used and things like that. You can kind of break it down, but it doesn't stretch very far, because unfortunately with New Criticism, you need a lot to work with. Things like epics and ballads for poems work because they're so long. Edgar Allan Poe works because it's so long. You can see established structure. But things like haikus don't work. They're too short, so you can't establish enough structure there. New Criticism also has a problem in that it was made in Britain. So when he made it, and I found this out when I did it, I tried to do a quatrain, which is from China. I wanted to do a Chinese quatrain that was translated. In New Criticism, you can't do that because I don't speak Chinese. And I can't read Chinese. So I had it translated for me. And because it was translated, that translations don't always go exact. Which means that I'm reading an interpretation of the poem. Which, for New Criticism, doesn't work. So New Criticism's section of what they count as literature is really short. It's basically anything that is in English or some French. Poems, the amount of what was considered literature in a poem is basically anything like Beowulf and on. And books have to be very specific, like Bartleby the Scrivener. Oh, very, very, very structured, very, very set. Reader Response by Stanley Fish is much wider range because you can apply it to things because you're allowed to have an interpretation of what the work says. You're still looking for structure and you're still looking for path and things, but it opens the gate a little more. That being said, there's a couple of things that really make reader response work. As I said, you can use interpretation, but there's a couple of people who are really important with reader response. Iser is a big one. Iser is a guy who sat there and came up with the idea of the gap. The way the gap works is when you're reading something, you're kind of filling in blanks that get left in the text. So, you read Harry Potter. Okay, so in Harry Potter, when you're reading that story, do they say explicitly what exactly is happening between Hagrid going to pick him up in the first book, and I'm going back to the first book, which is like almost 20 years ago at this point, but... Do they say what happens between Hagrid picking Harry up and him dropping him off at the train station?
In the book, they do mostly. It's actually Harry's family, his uncle, that takes him to the train station in the book. When they take him into town to drop him off at the train station, it just happens to be because Dudley has an appointment to have his tail removed.
Right.
And it's the only reason why they drove him into town to drop him off at the train station in the first place. Which is kind of funny.
So they give you an answer, but they still leave gaps of what happens in between those sections that you fill in yourself. You assume that they're sitting in a car and that they made it there. But that's not, they don't explicitly say, they all pile into the car. They all drive. They drove for blank amount of hours. They arrived at blank p.m. They don't, you fill that in as the reader.
Yeah, no, it's implied in the text, but not stated.
That's important for reader response because that implication is something you're allowed to use.
Okay.
There's two major points to reader response, and that thing that Iser is talking about ties into one of them. We'll get to the second one in a second. The first one is the death of the author. So that idea was come up with by a guy named Barthes. And he said, when you read something, you still, just like New Criticism, you can't focus on author intent. Because people said, well, if you're using interpretation, why can't I use the interpretation of the author? He made it, or she made it. She wrote it, so that's an interpretation that counts, right? And Barth argues, no, you can't do that because he wrote it, or she wrote it, at a very particular time, a very particular point. So their interpretation is going to be structured around that idea, that point in time. Poe, I think most people would agree that Edgar Allan Poe had a pretty messed up life. But, that being said, he didn't, if we sit there and we use the author's intent when he wrote it, things that he did that were considered okay are considered kind of taboo now, and vice versa. There are things that were considered taboo back then that aren't so much now. Society, unfortunately, has to change with, culture and the things that happen in history. So you have to be willing to remove what the author intended when they wrote things. That power is given to the second major part of reader response theory, which we'll get to in a second.
Okay.
So Rosenblatt is another famous person, and she argues that with reader response theory, most people read for one of two reasons. They read for pleasure, which is aesthetic, or they read to learn, which is efferent. That one's pretty easy. You're learning either because you enjoy it, you like to read, or you're reading because you want to get something out of it. But regardless of what you're doing, you are still trying to be the most correct that you possibly can. Meaning, when we read something, even if we're reading it just for fun, we don't do it and then just want to be wrong. So even if you're reading Harry Potter for fun, you don't sit there and want to assume that Harry is a girl. You still want to be correct. Even if it's just to enjoy it. And if you're learning something from it, you definitely want to be correct. All of this ties into comes back to Fish. And Fish's second major point, which is the interpretive community. So, if you read something, you personally read something, and you enjoy it, you can name a book that you like, whatever that would be.
Okay. That's kind of hard to pick, actually, but all right.
If you sat there and you picked a book that you really enjoy, and you had your interpretation of what something in the book meant, perhaps it was a little open-ended, or you are trying to get an overall theme out of the book. People argue from reader response theory, well, if I'm allowed to have my interpretation, and I've gone through all the structure, we've all sat there, you've sat down and looked, and you know what the structure is, you know what all the symbolism and hyperbole, and you've looked at the mechanical aspects of writing. And you've gone, okay, well, here's what I think this all means. People's original idea of what could possibly be wrong with reader response is, why would I ever need to talk to somebody else about it? It's my interpretation, and I think I'm right, so don't I have the most correct answer? And Fish argues no with his second major point, which is the interpretive community. Fish doesn't go too specific into what the size of an interpretive community is, so as far as we know, it's limitless. It's as small as one person and as large as everyone. But he does have two major qualifiers. One, you can read, write, or both with some semblance of skill. And two, you are comfortable in the genre that you are reading, writing, or both. So if I like science fiction, I like to write, and I'm working on a bachelor's degree, so I can write and read pretty competently. And I like science fiction. So if I'm writing or reading science fiction, I'm familiar with things like the tropes and the problems that come with it and some of the bonuses and some of the perks of writing science fiction. And because I'm familiar with the text, I have that authority and that skill to back it up. So I qualify to be an interpretive community. And anything that I assume you can read and write and or both because you have a degree.
Yeah.
And I assume you have genres you like. And that you feel comfortable enough to either read, write, or both.
Yeah.
So because of that... go ahead.
No, I'm good. Go ahead.
Sorry, by the way, Professor, there's a little bit of latency because we're sitting there and we're online. So there's gonna be times where I try not to... I have to sit there and stop talking. So you qualify to be in an interpretive community of anything that you can meet both of those criteria from, which is probably going to be pretty much anything that you read or write. One of the big portions of reader response theory is that interpretive community. And that interpretive community, like I said, if we go back to what Rosenblatt said, is we're sitting there and we're constantly striving for the most correct answer. So when we talk to other people in an interpretive community or other interpretive communities, we're attempting to get the most right answer that we can. This is kind of his checks and balances for people going, why don't I just have my own interpretation and then that's good enough? His way of checking is to make it cyclical. So we are constantly going to check for the most correct answer. We are going to take our answer and compare it to other people's. And we are going to basically look for things to add to our own or ways to fix ours to make it more appropriate or correct. So if you read a book, doesn't matter what that book is, and you have your interpretation, which is X, and you go up to other people and you say, my interpretation of this text is X. They would then go, okay, I see what you got out of that. I see how you got X, but I think the interpretation of this is X22 blue. So you got part of it. You were close. You had some. But here is the rest of it. And as long as they are only using the text and only the text that they were given, again, they are ignoring the author, they are ignoring other things, any outside forces. If they are only using the text as their evidence for X22 to blue or whatever I said. And you can see where they got that reasoning from. You, as you're going to be naturally looking for the most correct answer, are going to go, okay, you know what? I accept that. I'm going to change my interpretation to be X22 blue. So people are going to naturally gravitate to whichever is the most correct answer. And I realize that this makes problems, and we'll address that in a second.
Okay.
Another major factor in changing people's interpretations for these interpretive communities is not only going to be how distinct the answer is in terms of how detailed, if they can get, that X22 blue. But another big factor of interpretive communities is going to be the status and familiarity that they have. So our two qualifiers to get into an interpretive community, there are going to be people who are more qualified than either you or I. If even though I'm coming up on a bachelor's, if I come across somebody who has a master's degree in English, and I show them my interpretation of a text, and they go, okay, yep, no, you're getting there. But here's some other stuff that I can use the text as evidence to show you why this would be correct. I'm going to be more inclined to believe them. Because they put in the time and the effort and all of the work to do it. If you told me something about graphic design, I'm going to believe you. Because I'm not a graphic designer. Yes, I can work Photoshop, roughly. But it's not the same. You are adept at it. You've put in all that work. So I'm going to believe you more than I'm going to believe my own ideas on how, say, Photoshop is supposed to work. If I sit there and I go, look at the Magic Whip tool, it's so cool, and you go, okay, well, yes it is. That is a cool tool, but let me show you these other things not related to that. There's more buttons on the screen.
Yeah. I see what you mean. Okay.
So because of that, people who have more status and clout and who have a majority in terms of people who believe that interpretation, they're going to have more weight than people who don't. That's both good and bad. It is good in the sense that it does make it a circle. In theory, the people who have the most effort and time and status are going to be able to have interpretations of things, and that's going to trickle down to people who have less, who are probably going to be able to back up at least most of that, or be able to see where they got that idea from, and get the most correct answer, which will bring us right back to it basically cleaning up itself. So as a quick... Go ahead.
I sense a butt in there somewhere.
There is, and I will get to that in a second. So can you, just as a quick recap, can you vaguely tell me now what reader response theory is?
Okay. So reader response theory then is not just looking at the actual mechanics of literature, but also the person's interpretation of it, striving for the most accurate as presented by the community, hopefully coming to the most pure interpretation of the work.
Right. Can you remember any of the names of the people I mentioned?
No, but I am actually very bad at names. Like, atrociously bad at names. I can't remember people's names when I'm introduced to them in the same conversation.
Right.
I rely on, hey, you, dude, and stuff.
Do you remember Stanley Fish?
So, yes, I do remember Fish. Fish was the proponent of the theory we're talking about,
Do you remember who Iser was?
and he was in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
Iser. No, I remember you mentioned it before or after Fish.
Does the gap help?
No, I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. So he's the one who had that idea. All right.
Okay. And do you remember the name Rosenblatt? She's got a funny name, so.
Yeah, I do remember the name. I don't remember what she did, but was she the one that had the removing the author from the interpretation?
She is part of it, yes.
Or no? Okay.
Barth was this too, with the death of the author idea.
Okay, that's the one that had the death of the author.
Mm-hmm. And Rosenblatt had her two major ideas on why you read in general.
Okay, she was the two reasons, which is for pleasure or to learn something.
Right.
Okay.
And regardless, we always strive for...
the most complete understanding of the material.
Right. So, let me ask you a question.
Okay.
We're going to go back to the interpretive community, and we're going to suppose that you come across an interpretation of a text that you feel is pretty expansive.
Okay.
We're going to use Dracula for an example, because a lot of people have read Dracula.
Oh, God. Okay. Okay, here we go.
And you say your interpretation has to do with immigration. The story is an allegory for immigration, for example.
Okay.
And you come across somebody who says, I am a doctorate of English. So they have a PhD. And they say, okay, I see what you're getting at. However, I think it is closer to Dracula is actually about the darkness in the human soul. And
because they have the higher rank, essentially, their interpretation would negate yours.
Yes, effectively. And they have
which is the
people who
problem.
agree with them.
Okay.
So, according to Fish, what would you do?
Well, according to Fish, you would subscribe to their ideas instead because they have more people that believe it, and that would technically make it the more accurate.
Now, regardless of whether or not that's true, because what the interpretation is doesn't matter, but what happens then if that doctor, our pretend doctor, actually has a more wrong answer?
Well, realistically, you can't do anything about it under that theory, assuming, of course, that no one else will listen to you. It would basically shut down anyone else's interpretation as long as he reaches a larger audience with his interpretation.
And I wanted to sit there and get across this idea because a lot of people, every theory has its own problems. So I kind of wanted to address that too. Because I don't want you to sit there and just have to ask all of these questions. Because people will just be like, oh yeah, what about that? This is a problem, and this is a major critique of Fish's idea with reader response. Because if that happens, the system is no longer cyclical. Because it's no longer cleaning itself of the most correct answer. It now is effectively top down, where people who have high status and power have an answer that they believe to be the most correct, and they're actually stifling answers that might be better, but have an audience, have the time and the effort and all those things to back up their answer.
Yeah, I can see where that would be a problem.
At that point, and no theory has an answer to questions like this. I should make that clear. They all, as far as I can tell, tend to lead to an impasse where you have to make a conscious decision, where you kind of get stuck in a fork in the road and you go down one path or the other, and both have problems, but you kind of just have to let it go. You kind of just have to accept it for whatever theory you're using. If people come up to you and have an interpretation like that, you basically have two choices. You can accept it, and basically you have to trust them. There has to be some kind of implicit trust going, yes, I believe you. I'm going to trust that you are giving me an accurate interpretation, and you are not just lying to me, intentionally or otherwise. That's where you get the problems of it can potentially be top down. Or you can reject it. And if you reject it, the torch kind of gets passed to you to find an answer that is more correct. And more importantly, to get that more correct answer to be accepted by the interpretive community, regardless of size. That has problems too, because even if it does not get accepted, or if you just automatically reject anything that anybody says, you are basically bowing out of using the interpretive community. You basically said, no, thank you, I'm not doing that.
Which defeats the purpose of having it to begin with.
Right. Which,
okay.
Just like playing any kind of game, you have to be willing to accept the restrictions that you're using. All theories kind of have these restrictions that apply. And if you're not willing to use them, that's fine. You'd have to go and use a different theory. Even if you refuse to use any theory, that's still technically a theory. But that's independent. But for reader response, these are the lenses that you have to be willing to accept. Yes, there are clearly borders. I can see more than what I can see out of my hand right now, because I know that there's other stuff outside of it. But just like any kind of theory, I'm accepting that I'm only going to look at what's on the inside of this border, and that this border is going to be my edges. Even though you and me are talking right now, I know that there's more to your house than this rectangle I can see. I can see a rectangle with your face in it and a little bit. Yeah, see, I know that there's more, but for the purposes, just like with theory, I'm going to accept that this rectangle is all I have. So this is all I get to work with. I have to work within these bounds in order to make this theory work, to make any theory work.
Okay.
So, with all that said, obviously if you can sit there and, just like there are problems, there are also benefits. When you reject an answer and you can come up with a more correct answer, Fish's system, when working correctly, can be cyclical, because if you've rejected it and come up with a better answer, if you can get all of these people to agree with you, you can knock on that doctor's door and say, hey, me and these other people all behind me, we all think that you're wrong now. At which point they have to reevaluate their answer or reevaluate their answer.
I can see where having that community would have its benefits, because it does promote more thought and a better understanding of the material. But I have to question whether human nature can allow that to function the way it should.
Okay.
because you can't rely on people to always agree to a system and move on. There's always going to be someone that wants to control the system or break the system.
Right.
And anytime you rely on the goodwill of others, as bad as it sounds, you end up yeah, it just
It doesn't always work.
yeah, it I could draw a parallel to different political systems,
Mm-hmm.
to certain ones that, may have been in use at one point or another that sound great on paper until you actually have to put them in practice, and then, relying on everyone to pitch in and, give back to the community
Mm-hmm.
doesn't work the way it's supposed to. Personally, I don't know how I feel about the author not having a say in the interpretation.
Okay.
I mean, I guess if they wanted to look at their work and add it to the community and say, "Hey, look, this is this is what I thought while I was writing it."
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think it's a little silly to just dismiss what the author intended out of hand. But like you said, it also depends on where the author was at that point in their life when they wrote it, and you might not be in that situation, so you kind of have to dismiss their interpretation unless you're in their shoes, basically.
Right. If you have any questions, rip it apart. Sit there and say anything that you think that might be a problem or any kind of issues, and I'll do my best to answer it. This is why I wanted to talk to a real person, because I figure you'll...
Yeah. Okay, well, we've already touched on the first problem of the community has a potential to become stale.
Yep.
Because certain individuals may be unwilling to change their minds.
Mm-hmm.
I do like the idea of collective efforts where people work together to come up with an idea. That's great, and for the most part would work like as intended. And as I said, I don't like the idea that the author's interpretation is taken out entirely,
Mm-hmm.
but I can understand why. Just
It seems strange.
yeah.
And there are theories that don't use that. There are theories where the author intent can come back into play. It's just this one, and there are a couple others, but this one that I taught you that does not have that.
Okay. But like you said, you want me to specifically talk about this one.
Mm-hmm.
I personally have a lot of trouble with dealing with people's interpretations of work
Okay.
because I don't know if you've come across this, but some people have a tendency to read too much into things.
Mm-hmm.
You can end up with a situation where someone will debate the meaning of why there was a pond outside a person's house in a story, and it's because the author wanted them to have a pond because they've always wanted a pond, but that doesn't matter in this case. But
Right.
you could end up with really odd interpretations in this case because, well, they had a pond, and obviously it meant they were, I don't know. Again, I'm not an English major, so I don't know all the
Fishing
correct
term.
terminology. Yeah, it's you can come up with some very interesting theories, I guess, from this because you don't have any resources to limit your interpretation beyond your own personal interpretation and what's physically written down.
Mm-hmm.
And if the author used an odd turn of phrase, it could lead to some really weird interpretations. Like,
My example was somebody sat there and argued that the Green Eggs and Ham is secretly a Marxist movement, and talking about revolution. That's my example.
Okay, explain.
So, before I sit there and I say that, Fish argues that every interpretation is valid as long as you have evidence within the text to back it up. That doesn't mean that you have the most correct, because she, or rather he, makes it very clear that those are not the same thing. You're allowed to have whatever interpretation you want. If you sat there and you read, to go back to Harry Potter, if you sat there and you read Harry Potter and Harry Potter is clearly the bad guy in your story, and you go, he's a bad guy. A lot of stuff gets broken. People die around him. He sits there and sets people up. He's kind of selfish. And you can sit there and you can point to points in the text where this applies. Your interpretation is just as valid as anyone else's. And so if your overall theme that you took out of the story, your overall interpretation of all the books is evil takes many forms, you have an interpretation and it's perfectly valid. However, there are other people who would probably argue that the overall theme of Harry Potter would be something like love conquers all. And you would probably have more people who would agree with that point than evil takes many forms. So
I could see that.
Just like I said with Green Eggs and Ham, yes, I can probably read that book where it has Marxist tendencies, where clearly the other guy, the non-Sam I Am guy, is being oppressed upon by Sam I Am, and Sam I Am is trying to push this agenda upon him in a way that he comes to accept, and I can use the text as examples of that. However, if somebody else just goes, yeah, I think the interpretation is trying new things is good for you, so don't just throw it out. Other people are going to go, I'm going to tend with what feels like the more correct answer, which is the second one and not the one that involves Marxism.
What's funny is you mentioned, you started talking about the interpretation of how he's oppressed and everything, and it's funny because I can see that, but not in the context of the story.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. Wow, okay.
There's an entire theory dedicated to looking at Marxism in theories. Or Marxism in stories. You're looking for that sort of thing. And there's theories for just about everything. And another key point that I want to point out just about literary theory is that not all theories play well together. Most of the time they don't play well together at all.
Okay.
If you, for example, really like New Criticism, and I really like Reader Response, because I've talked about both of those, and I go, well, here's what I thought about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then you take it and you're like, why did you hand me this? And you throw it away. Because I've handed you something that can't be used. For you, interpretation has no point. It's only what the text has given you. And so I'm like, well, what does this make you think? It makes me think that that word means this, because that's what it's a simile. But what do you think that they're trying to say? I think they're trying to say the words that they put on the page. They don't play well together, and me sitting there and going, well, what do you think about that little girl running through the tulips? And somebody who believes heavily in Marxism would go, well, obviously the tulips are the oppressed here because they're being downtrodden by the little girl as she runs through the field. And I go, okay, but what do you actually think that means? Like, not who's being controlled or oppressed upon. That is what it means.
That's amazing. Just wow. Okay.
And somebody who likewise sat there and said, "Boy, I really like the Hunger Games because of the the intricate political system that's implied within." And somebody who goes New Criticism says, "Okay, yep, nope, I buy that. There is a political system within." And then they go, well, I really feel like sometimes that the people who are on top are being oppressed because blah, blah, blah. And then they go, no, see, that's interpretation. I don't care. So
Wow.
all theories play together. It's just like playing a game. If we bring it to a game that you and I both play, I'm not allowed to. We both play 40K, so when we sit down, we both kind of agree on what we're gonna do. I'm not allowed to play with double the amount of stuff that you are, because I think we can both agree that that's not how we're playing.
Likewise, I wouldn't bring chess pieces to a Warhammer 40K game.
Right, because it doesn't.
And expect to use chess rules.
Yeah, because it doesn't work. We've broken. We must both agree to use our limitations and then see what we can get out of those limitations. A lot of times people's questions revolve around, well, what about this and this? I understand that, but we still, for better or for worse, we have to look at it within the scope that we're given. We have to look at it through the lens that we're using, if you want to think of it like a movie projector. I don't know why you want to watch that movie in the shape of a dog, but we are watching it through the shape of the dog, so that's as good as it gets.
What would that look like?
There'd be some interesting movies. If you have any questions, let me know.
No, I did find that fascinating, though.
Do you feel like you learned something about reader response theory?
Yeah. And theories for, breaking down literature in general. Well, thank you for that.
Thank you, sir. I'll sit there and I will turn this in. This is about 46 minutes, so I'll sit there and I'll start this, and it should be done uploading sometime around tomorrow, or at least that's how I feel. Thank you, and I will sit there and I'll stop the recording now. Thank you.